Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nuzat, and welcome to the How to Engage Survivors and Communities Impacted by FGMC, introducing the FGMC Engagement Toolkit webinar. We're still waiting for folks to trickle in, so please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, location, organization, if you belong to one, and what brought you here today. We'd love to know who's in the room with us today, so feel free to introduce yourself as we wait for more folks to join. We'll just wait another minute or so before we officially begin. Great. So we're going to go ahead and officially get started now, but please feel free to continue to introduce yourself in the chat box as we get started. Please also note that this webinar is recorded today and we'll also have closed captioning available. So thank you again for joining us today for our webinar to introduce our new toolkit as a resource for those working in the movement to end FGMC. As many of you recognize, FGMC, female genital mutilation slash cutting, is a violation of the human rights of women and girls with profound long-term physical, psychological, and social consequences. In the movement to end FGMC and support those impacted, engagement is key to progress. Engagement is about bringing everyone into the conversation, and the toolkit we'll be uplifting today is specifically centered on discussions around community engagement for survivors and communities impacted by FGMC. Every voice and every ally can play an important role in driving change and preventing future generations from continuing FGMC. During this webinar, we're going to describe the key components of the How to Engage Survivors and Communities Impacted by FGMC Toolkit and explore specific ways in which the toolkit can support organizations' community engagement efforts. This toolkit was built off of real-world examples that partner organizations are actively applying community engagement practices to in order to address FGMC in their work and services. And we also designed the toolkit in a way to support others to gain insights, strategies, and lessons learned from those working in the FGMC space. Finally, before we move on to the next slide, I do want to recognize that FGC is a difficult topic to discuss, and we do want to acknowledge that there may be survivors in the room. So though we don't have any graphic imagery or triggering content, we do recognize that individuals could be triggered with the discussion, and we welcome folks to take care of themselves and feel free to leave the webinar if needed. We can move on to the next slide. So just to give a brief overview of our agenda for today, we'll first review the purpose and development of the toolkit, including a guided walkthrough of its key strategies and applications. And then we'll also highlight the contributions of 3 community partners who played a very central role in shaping the resource. And additionally, representatives from these 3 partner organizations will share their approaches to community engagement in the context of their work. And then we hope to conclude this webinar with a dedicated Q&A segment to offer participants the opportunity to directly ask questions to any of the panelists. Next slide, please. Great. So thank you everyone again for joining our discussion today. Just a reminder that my name is Nuzat Zaman. I'm the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator here at SEO, and I'll be facilitating the webinar as well as moderating the panel discussion. Slide. So we first wanted to give folks who are not familiar with SEO just an overview of our organization. SEO's mission is to empower Asian and other communities to end female genital cutting and create positive social change through dialogue, education, and collaboration based on community involvement. The organization was formed in 2015 as an advocacy collective of South Asian and other survivors of FGC, also known as female genital mutilation, to address the lack of acknowledgement of FGC as gender-based violence and child abuse impacting U.S. women. 10 years later, we now work with all communities impacted by FGMC. SAIL empowers underrepresented communities to advocate for their inclusion within FGC discourse and support them to create systemic change to end this centuries-long practice. SAIL utilizes collaborative grassroots campaigns and storytelling techniques to train communities to lead this change. SAIL also partners with frontline workers, such as healthcare providers, to create culturally sensitive systems of care for survivors and with the government to address policy level change. Next slide. All right, and now just to give a quick introduction of all three of our panelists, we can move on to the next slide. So our first panelist we'll have joining us today is Hajar Shaukat, and she serves as the Deputy Director at Sauti Yetu Center for African Women. So beginning in 2016, Ms. Shaukat previously served as Program Director, where she established and oversaw Sauti Yetu's Community Wellness Department to provide tailored health education and resources on reproductive health and FGC. And Hajar expanded the scope of the department's work to include outreach and education for other health-based services to improve the health and well-being of African immigrants in New York City. So Hajar, if you want to come off camera and say hi super quickly. Or we could just move on. That's completely fine. So we will move on to the next slide to introduce our second panelist. So Teresa Timu is a cultural educator and community advocate specializing in language access, refugee support, and trauma-informed outreach. And she's led programs addressing FGMC, family strengthening, and immigrant integration through her work with Us Together and other grassroots initiatives. And Teresa brings a multilingual, cross-cultural lens to every space she enters, rooted in her lived experience as a Tanzanian Belarusian mother, educator, and community connector. So Teresa, if you'd like to come off camera and say hi really quick, please feel free.
Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to be a part of this very important discussion today, and I'm excited to hear more from the organizers and our sister organizations in the country. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Teresa. And then we can move on to the next slide for our last panelist. So Maria Tahir is an award-winning social activist with 15 years of experience dedicated to ending gender-based violence through teaching, research, policy development, program creation, and direct service. And she first began her career working at domestic violence organizations such as Asian Women's Shelter, Women Incorporated, Jane Doe Incorporated, and Saheli. And in 2015, she co-founded SEO, a leading transnational organization committed to empowering Asian and other communities to end FGC. If Maria, you want to come off camera and say hi really quickly.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Maria, and just really excited to be able to share this toolkit as well. It was a very long endeavor and we learned a lot of information. And one thing I just want to uplift is the community engagement strategies you're going to hear and the work that we were talking about too really does talk about organizations in the US specifically that are doing work on FGNC and engagement strategies. And so they can be applicable to other parts of the world, but we also recognize there may be other strategies out there that are more in use in other parts of the world where FGMC is being addressed. So just wanted to mention that and looking forward to showcasing our toolkit and having other panelists talk about their own experiences working on FGMC.
Thank you, Maria. And we can move on to the next slide. So just to give a bit more context about our toolkit, this toolkit provides guidance on best practices for outreach to FGMC impacted communities and is intended for organizations and individuals who are working on prevention efforts to end FGMC and support survivors. So throughout 2023 and 2024, we worked on gathering information and insight from partner organizations to build a toolkit around tips and strategies around the practices they had used to engage with individuals and communities to address FGMC. And we also interviewed individuals representing 9 organizations, and we completed those interviews in February of 2024. Next slide. So these are just highlighting the organizations that SAO collaborated with, several different organizations who are very involved in producing this toolkit for creating engagement. And individuals from each of these organizations provided valuable insights on addressing FGMC across the United States. And so those partner organizations include the African Cultural Alliance of North America, African Family Health Organization, Anoli Sisters, Global Women Peace Foundation, International Institute of Minnesota, iSave, Nile Sisters Development Initiative, Sauti Yatu, Silence Speaks, and FGMC, the US Network, US Together, and RTI International. Next slide. And we just want to go over why we created this toolkit. So this toolkit was created because we had recognized in our own work here that community engagement matters and is vital in the work to address FGC. Community engagement is a dynamic effort where each aspect can contribute to a broader and more widespread impact, from providing resources and professional referrals to fostering open conversations about FGMC. Every single element plays a crucial role in prevention and support. And these efforts can pave the way for long-term changes too, such as in social norms, improved mental health, patient and policy advocacy, and the development of leadership and mentorship among those with lived experiences, helping them to support and guide fellow community members. Overall, engagement is crucial for effectively addressing and preventing FGMC because engagement involves connecting with survivors, their families, and community members to foster understanding and support. And every single voice, including those of men, adolescents, and community leaders, plays an extremely vital role in driving the change against FGMC. And building a movement always requires challenging harmful social norms that justify FGMC based on tradition and cultural beliefs. Next slide. So before we dive deep into the toolkit and how it works, we just want to give a high-level overview of the toolkit's table of contents. And as the outline here on the screen shows, the toolkit is quite extensive, and we do have various sections which we'll dive into next inside this presentation. And one note to make is that the toolkit has incorporated a variety of tools in it itself, such as sharing video content, images, quotes, case studies, a decision tree, and much more. Next slide. So this toolkit is divided into 4 sections. The first one is survivor and community engagement and overview. The second one is ethical and cultural considerations. So we won't dive into these today. However, we included guidelines around ethical and cultural considerations to make when creating programming because we recognize that FGC is so deeply intertwined with culture and identity. Therefore, it's critical to lead with trauma-informed, respectful, and survivor-centered practices. The third section is strategies to conduct survivor and community engagement. And the last one is decision-making and programming and program and event planning. So in this toolkit, once you're actually in it, you can click the boxes to go directly to a section. And then the toolkit was designed to align with common adult learning processes. So by organizing the toolkit into specific sections, we provide a systematic approach to addressing the complex issues surrounding FGMC. Although there may be some overlap between some of the sections, each one builds on the previous, and this offers a comprehensive understanding of community and survivor engagement. Go to the next slide. So engaging communities and survivors in conversations and efforts to end FGMC requires a very multifaceted and thoughtful approach. So this strategies to conduct survivor and community engagement section outlines 5 main categories of strategic approaches to survivor and community engagement, and all of these draw upon examples from various organizations and their programming initiatives. And our speakers today will discuss more of that as well. And it's important to note here that the examples highlighted within the toolkit are not exhaustive, and many examples obviously can fall under several different categories. So we can move on to the next slide. And this slide right here is an example from the strategy section of the toolkit. You can see here how each strategy within the toolkit is laid out with case studies, practical examples, and key takeaways. We really wanted to highlight this for you all so you can get a good sense of how the toolkit is organized and also how user-friendly it is when applying these strategies in real-world settings. Go to the next slide. And this example from SEO is from the toolkit as well, which highlights the power of storytelling. So by creating safe spaces for survivors to share their personal experiences, they build empathy, trust, and advocacy within communities. And it really shows how sharing stories can spark dialogue and strengthen engagement. Next slide. We also have an example here from Sauti Yetsu's Hands Project, which is a great example of building peer support. And they created opportunities for young people to interview and connect with others in their communities, which helped amplify unheard voices and foster solidarity. This approach centers survivors' perspectives and builds long-term empowerment. And this last example that we'll highlight here is from Us Together, which shows how important sustained relationships are. And their programs support families not just in the first months, but for years, creating trust and continuity of care. So by making services accessible, like holding events in neighborhoods and offering childcare, they demonstrate what lasting engagement could look like for organizations. Next slide. So during our gathering of information, one piece of feedback we received was that it may be helpful to create a tool to help individuals and groups think through what type of engagement they want to conduct, and in connection, what kind of events or programming would be needed to do so. So with that in mind, we created these decision trees laid out here, and you can also find these in the toolkit. So folks can use the first decision tree on the left to really help you think about different modalities and accessibility considerations for the event or for the program you choose. And then you can take a look at the decision tree on the right and use that one to help determine the best type of event or program for your organization to host for your goals. Next slide. So that's just an overview of our toolkit, and we hope that you will peruse it to learn more and go through what we've shared in more details. To learn more about the toolkit, you can visit the SEO website, and we'll also be sharing the link in the chat for the toolkit. But now we want to transition to our panel to hear from folks talk a bit more about the specific case studies and strategies they resonated with from our toolkit that they now engage with in their work. And go ahead and move on to the next slide. And then since we're starting the panel questions, we'll just stop sharing screen and we'll be focusing on the panel discussion in the panel speaking. All right, so we're first going to start with Maria, and I'll ask you the first question and you can answer first. The first question is, how do you approach engagement in your work?
Yeah, so thank you all for, or thank you, Nusat, for laying out the toolkit. And it is very extensive, so we definitely hope that people will visit it. And we really just wanted to give a high level of what's in the toolkit and how it can be utilized. And as Nusat meant, it's very interactive, so there are videos as well that you can click on to hear people talking about engagement. So kind of wanted to uplift that. And in thinking about engagement, I think our toolkit reflects one important thing is in terms of diversity of approaches and really thinking about there isn't just one answer to engagement. It really is about being versatile and trying many different things and seeing what makes the most sense. And some audiences, some individuals respond to a virtual method. Some respond to in-person, some are WhatsApp, some are really, you need to approach them, but really kind of recognizing that engagement takes work. And it isn't something that you can just necessarily try once in one way. And if it doesn't work, say it's not going to work. That isn't something that is work. So it also takes persistence. And I think that's another thing that I always think about when I'm thinking about approaching engagement is persistence. And I mean, you have to be also persistent try a lot of reasons, and also recognize that you may fail in some of these reasons. But in that failing, you are learning what isn't working, and you may also go into what will work. And you have to think about just also, how do you connect with others? What are the ways in the populations you're working with that really help them to build that trust in that relationship and want to get information from you as well? And all of that takes that persistence. And then just one other point I wanted to make connected to that is listening, learning about what people, uh, what works for them, how they will be engaged, what they might be receptive to, also means practicing deep listening and, empathetic listening, and really trying to gauge what are the resources they need and what are they telling you. And then as an organization or an advocate in this space, how can I use that information to create that programming that would support either prevention or support of survivors, depending on what it is that you're looking for. But those are just a little bit about how I approach engagement.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Maria. And so, Hajar, I'll ask you the same question. How do you approach engagement in your work and the work that you do?
Yeah, I think for Sotia too, and I've apologized for the technical issues earlier, but I've been working on our FGC work for over about a decade now, and so I've seen that there's a big piece of connecting with community and allowing room for flexibility, and that needs will change, and that what's priority for the community will change over time. So when as much as we center building resources that are for the community, we also take into account that the community may also come back at certain points and say, okay, we're ready to pivot. And I know we'll talk about this a bit more, but we've been, particularly in our FGC work, because we're doing so much to simplify a very complex topic and also utilize a trauma-informed approach without triggering folks as much as possible, without sort of feeding into the stigma and the resistance that is very real in the community. And we're trying to counter that. So a big piece of it is understanding the sensitive nature of the topic and, in a way, sort of opening the scope, providing that safe space that community members can then feel like, okay, I can come and understand what the practice is, get accurate health information. I think that has been a big piece as to why we're able to build those community connections, is using more of a public health approach, for example, or, coming from a space where people are less threatened and can feel like this is a cultural practice. I want to understand what happened to me, and guiding them through the process bit. And so we utilize that approach. We utilize that approach to start building that connection. And I think the big piece is starting from a space where people feel safe. So not just, giving out very direct messaging from the get-go. That's been our approach. It's been successful, especially with youth, with adult women as well, who are still maybe coming to terms with what happened and are now trying to really seek, like, what do I do next? What resources are available to me? And we want to be able to guide them through that conversation in a way that is really productive. So I think that's been a big piece of the approach as well. And thinking about like the availability of resources and making sure that it's accessible by people from all backgrounds, people from different languages. And so we try and instill that in each of the different parts of programming that we provide for youth and adults to better understand the practice.
Awesome. Thank you, Hajar. And then same question for you, Teresa. How do you approach engagement in your work?
We meet clients where they are, literally and culturally. We provide services not just in offices, but in neighborhoods and in apartment complexes where refugees and immigrant families live. A good example is that our office is founded by refugee women and for refugee people. Most of our staff is multilingual, and we always have interpreters, sometimes on site, sometimes call-in interpreters. That helps a lot with language barriers. Our office is located in neighborhoods where most of our clients reside. That is Northside Columbus. Whoever is from Columbus would definitely know that. Also, engagement is built on trust and continuity. Most of our programs are unfortunately officially for only 90 days, but clients keep on returning for years after that because they know that we are a safe space close to their homes in the neighborhood. We always have multilingual staff members who speak their language. We have Somali speakers, Kinyarwanda, Swahili speakers, Arabic speakers, and many others. So our clients and our women in our community know that we are a safe and a consistent resource. And we also do our best to remove barriers to engagement, offering things like childcare, on-site childcare, transportation support, and trauma-informed spaces and practices.
Awesome. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you all for answering that first question. So we can move on to the second question, and this question is kind of split up into two parts, so you can answer however you're most comfortable, but it's we'll again start with Mario. So how do the strategies outlined in the toolkit show up in the work that you do? And then the second part is there anything else you can uplift from the example that we shared in the webinar today about your organization, or any other examples from your organization that are also
Yeah, definitely happy to. When I was hearing Teresa speak, I was just thinking about like, oh yeah, that's why we put that in the toolkit. Just like thinking about longevity of relationships and how important that is, trust. And these were different things that we kept hearing from many of the organizations that we spoke with. And so you will find information about all of that in the toolkit as well too. But in terms of some of the examples that we shared with SEO that are found in the toolkit, one news that you presented was for our Voices project. And we really placed that under relationship building and the power of storytelling to help with that relationship building. I think our Voices project helps in many different ways, but that was what we wanted to help uplift. And for those who are not familiar, SEO does a digital storytelling project, which we've done for 9 years now, where we bring together individuals, survivors, advocates, to come into small circles. We usually have no more than 10, and then we host what's called a story circle, where everyone gets to share their experiences. And these folks, some of them may have known each other previously, some of them don't know each other. Some of them have shared their story, some have not shared their story. So it can feel very intimidating at first too, but there is this being vulnerable in that type of situation and in a safe space where there's also kind of guidelines that have been developed and discussed beforehand really helps to build that relationship in community just within that group. And we've seen how individuals have wanted to stay connected with our organization, so longevity after that as well too, in many different ways, or just stay connected in this FGMC space or use the story that they create from that workshop for future instances too. And so we do a lot of work around that in that particular project. Is not only is it to create a digital story, but it is also about building that community, that support group, particularly when survivors may be isolated in their experience and you're brought up in instances where you're conditioned or you're told not to talk about it, right? Or you're told that it's shameful to talk about. And so and when you have that around, being in an experience where you openly can talk about it can feel very healing and something that I hear over and over again, like we've just never had this space. We never knew we could talk about it like this. And people very much connect when they're been given that opportunity to do so. And we found that helps with building trust. That helps just thinking about how you connect folks to resources as well too, and giving agency back to individuals. And so there's a lot to process of relationship building and how story sharing can be one avenue in that relationship building. So that's just a little bit about that example. Couple of other examples that you'll see in the toolkit talk about, well, one of them I'll bring up in particular is we have one of our strategies, we have 5 again, was safety and well-being. And I know that safety and well-being was important to many of the organizations that contributed to this toolkit. And one example we give in particular is that we have been really uplifting and recognizing individuals who are survivors of FGC who also identify with the LGBTQI plus community, and hearing how individuals have felt left out of the discourse or just discussion around FGMC, and feeling like they don't have a space, and or that intersection not being recognized as well too. And so we had created a webinar where we were able to bring in some of our individuals that are participating in our program who were comfortable sharing and talking about their experiences and who wanted to. And so we gave them that support, those resources, and helped them kind of put on this webinar as well as a first kind of initiative. And then since then, we've just really been intentional with the work that we're doing and thinking about in the language we use, in the resources we create, in the trainings we do. Do we mention and recognize that FGMC happens to not just cisgendered women or girls as well too? And so being intentional in that way helps create that safety and well-being for survivors who traditionally have felt excluded. And so that's something like we do a lot of listening to and working with them and thinking about like what are other things that we could potentially do to be more intentional. But I have a few other examples, but I think it may be wonderful to hear from Teresa and Hajar as well too.
Yeah, of course. So I'll ask Hajar next the same question. How do the strategies outlined in the toolkit show up in the work that you do? And then is there anything else you can uplift from the example that we highlighted earlier, or any other examples from your organization that are awesome?
Sorry, my computer froze for a second. Yeah, I think the example that's been highlighted in, okay, I'm actually going to hand it over to Teresa for a second since I have a little one back here. Teresa, please go ahead and I'll be right back.
My little one is napping right now, so I totally get what Hajar has gone through. So I would start with collaboration and partnership, which are a key. We know that FGM/C is not just a medical issue, not just a legal issue. It's a complex experience that touches health, mental health, and immigration status. So we've built partnerships with mental health providers, with counselors, with healthcare providers, with immigration lawyers who are providing for us pro bono services to ensure that our clients have comprehensive support. Then we invest a lot in resource buildings where we can't provide services directly. For example, we partner with Legal Aid of Columbus to create letter templates that women can take to OBGYN appointments to help retrieve documents from asylum cases. And we've provided clinics with CDC booklets that explain FGMC and its long-term health effects. This not only helps our clients, but also educates local providers, strengthening the entire support system. Another very important strategy is accessible programming, that what I have mentioned earlier. We organized support groups that are linguistically and culturally tailored, an art therapy for Tigrinya-speaking women from Eritrea, a health and wellness group for Arabic and English speakers from Sudan, Libya, Egypt, Ghana, and Somalia, and even quilting group for our Tigrinya speakers from Eritrea. And I think that you all know what is quilting is, basically making something from small items and things of clothing, or sewing things. And this sewing was a metaphor for healing and rebuilding. Also, our services are very client-centered. We avoid a one-size-fits-all model. And as Maria said, listening, communication is one of the important keys of providing comprehensive and holistic services to our clients, to our community. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Teresa. And then now we can move on to Hajar.
Yes. Yeah, I think just really building on what Maria and Teresa said is like the topic of FGC is so complex, and so our modalities for reaching community members needs to be just as multifaceted. And so there's what the example that's actually shared in the toolkit is regarding the Hands Project, which is a youth-led storytelling initiative that Sotiatu started with our high school students. Actually back in 2010. And we've been working with international high schools, which means these are students that have arrived in the country within like the last 4 years. And so in addition to getting our usual math and English and social studies topics, Sotiatu was really there to support them through their professional and personal development. And some of that was, meeting language needs and just helping them understand where their larger cultural experiences sort of fit into this new dynamic after having immigrated here. And so the students had found that, we're learning about FGC in school, but there's a disconnect between what we actually experienced or what we know from our communities back home and what we're seeing here. And so we allowed them, like as Maria said before, storytelling is very important. So we just allowed them to tell us what was your experience? What did that look like for you? What does that mean now that you're here? And we collected those stories over, I believe, about 6 years or so from these young women. And then we're in the Hands Project itself, it's really a compilation of what we learned from all of those stories. And throughout the entire process, we made sure that we shared it back to young women. And these are high schoolers. These are, like in college. And so they're young mothers, they're new mothers. And so it was so beautiful for them to still share that they resonated with the sort of main points that the young girls shared. And so we took those interviews, we turned it, into resources on the website where folks can learn about FGC, can learn about the practice, can learn about again, thinking about our public health approach of like, what's physically happening to the body. Let's just hang out in that area for a little bit. And then we're also discussing the psychological consequences. And then of course, including what someone could do next is very important. So if I'm, feeling like I need referrals to additional services, if I need health insurance, if I need counseling services, all of these things that are really like the next step. And sometimes these young women will say, you know what, I feel okay. What I'd really like to focus on is how do I get to college? How can I convince my parents that I'm at this crossroads? I really want to go to college. I don't want to go to work, for example, or in a community where early marriage, forced marriage is a very real thing. How do we help them navigate those conversations? And sometimes it's really by modeling that through the FGC workshops that we have. We think about, what are some communication skills and strategies that folks really need to benefit from? We discuss it in the workshop, of course, in the context of FGC, but a lot of folks really love to know, how can I take this and apply it elsewhere? How can I take this as a life skill? And it helps do two things when we mirror it that way, in the sense that I think folks can better express themselves in the practice of FGC, and sometimes even in, the words aren't there in English or in their language, and we're, again, just trying to help them understand what happened. And it also allows them to think about sort of the larger scope and structure of how they want to build their lives, of how they want to take advantage of their rights, of how can they help themselves. I think that was the main takeaway from the Hands Project, is these young girls just want to know how to build their dreams, make them a reality, and ideally bring their family and their loved ones along. And so sometimes they are that bridge, and we're just, one piece of that, helping them, put all the puzzle pieces together. And so we learned so much from the Hands Project. There's much more, of course, to share on the website. And there's also a booklet, and I believe there's some videos that are forthcoming as well, but and of course the community workshop. So it's a multifaceted project. And I will say, I think the last piece of this too is that we've learned so much of the process of building the Hands Project. Another example is actually our involvement through the Women's Health Needs Study that the CDC conducted, I believe in 2021 now. But it was so important to be able to share back what was learned from the community. So we built into that dissemination. So it's so much of the community engagement is learning from community members and informing what we're creating based on that to sort of give back to the community. And along the way, we have to be able to collect those data points that can share what it is we actually were hoping to, achieve and how far we got down that road. And I find the community members that helped us develop the resources are like first in line to learn about how far did we get with this? How many workshops did you do? How many folks did you speak to? What were their questions like? What were their conversations like? And so we sort of keep that engagement, sustaining that engagement that we have, even as we continue to roll out the resources with community members.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hajar. So we're just going to quickly do this last question that we have, which is pretty general, which is, and start with Maria again. Do you have any advice for others hoping to increase community engagement?
Yeah, and I just want to actually say that, Hajar, what you shared, I love that because I always think about research and I think about like how do we disseminate the information back into communities in a way that is informative, but also supports their needs, their learning, and whatever they're doing too. Because I think oftentimes research can be conducted and not necessarily thought of as in terms of how do you disseminate back to people that you actually spoke to for the research. So I'm so glad you shared that example. But to the last question about any other advice for others hoping to increase community engagement, I would say we didn't have time to go over it in detail, but in the toolkit, news that you mentioned, we have these guiding principles, and that really came through with thinking about ethical considerations, cultural considerations, other things that are important when you're doing community engagement work. And so I definitely refer folks to look at the toolkit and all those principles, and they came out of the conversations that we had with all these various organizations, including us together in Satuyetu, as part of the organizations we worked with as well too. But I think they're just helpful to think about if you're a seasoned veteran doing community engagement work, or if you're even just new on the scene or trying to make some sort of program or to address FGMC. And then I guess I would also say, I mentioned this earlier, but for me at least, I feel like I am still learning. Even if we've had success in the past in some of our programming or methodology, it may change. And I feel like the other speakers mentioned this as well too. Circumstances change as well, and you need to be flexible and you need to adapt and you need to be open to trying many different approaches as well when it comes to engagement, to learn what works, what doesn't work, and you have to be receptive to being able to try many different approaches as well too. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is I found that when it comes to engagement works, making things as easy as possible for the communities you're trying to work with is really helpful. So I think even going an extra mile to connect to those individuals can really help. The folks that we work with, everybody is busy in many different ways, whether it's family, whether it's work, other reasons that come up too, and I think thinking about accessibility is really important, and I think our speakers also mentioned this too, but so thinking about how do you make something easy. Accessibility could be transportation, it could be childcare, it could be language access, it could be mobility physically, there could be something else. um Oftentimes we try to think about that with our programming, and if we have funding, we try to think about, can we raise funds to cover all those costs so that folks don't have to pay anything out of pocket to be able to take part in our programs, whether that means transportation, even travel costs or anything like that too. And we also think about communication methods. What are the easiest communication methods? And we mentioned it in the toolkit because it kept coming up, but WhatsApp is something that seems to work for a lot of individuals and organizations as well too. So finding those ways to share information, if that's more effective, is really important. But really think about how can you make things as easy as possible for the communities you're hoping to work with, I think is really important.
Thank you, Maria. And then same question for you, Teresa. Do you have any advice for others hoping to increase community? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
The first thing I would say is always start with trust. Communities that we are working with, they have very often experienced displacement, trauma, or stigma, and they need to know that they are safe, respected, and understood before they will open up. And the engagement isn't something that we can rush. It has to be built slowly and intentionally. I will totally agree with Maria that removing barriers like transportation and language access. I don't need to repeat about that. Another piece of advice is don't work in silos. None of us can do this job alone. And the best way is to partner with lawyers, healthcare providers, mental health providers. And finally, we need to show up consistently. Communities always see that when an organization show up only for one program, they complete grant requirements, let us say, and then it disappears. Communities see that. So we need to stay there consistently, and real engagement comes from being present in neighborhoods, checking in even there is nothing to deliver technically, and sustaining relationships over time. And this kind of consistency builds credibility and belonging. And ultimately, that is what is making engagement last.
Thank you. And then Heather, you can help us finish off with the questions. Do you have any advice for others hoping to increase?
Yeah. I think outreach or building community connections is one of those things that we know how to do it. It's just a matter of how can we really, as Maria said, like actively listen, understand the community, and then bring the resources, the conversations, the tools, whatever they're asking for, first and foremost before necessarily jumping in and saying like, oh, we have a workshop for the community. So I think that recognizing that stated need, speaking to that, and I think alongside that too is also recognizing the value of the input that the community members have to offer. And so there's each one of us, and I love this about the toolkit, that each one of us has a different sort of reason for reaching out to the community, for building these community connections, because our work looks different. And I appreciate that the toolkit has different avenues, sort of like, what might work best for you. I think it's just as important to keep an open mind and continue to be innovative in that approach, because it can look different depending on where you are in the country. It can look different. We're in New York City, so wherever you are in different borough, it could look very different, and the community could want to build a connection in a different way. So being able to, in a way, be malleable to that and connect with folks as they see, as they really want that connection to work best. And recognizing that they definitely have so much to offer to this work. I remember that, when I started doing this work and we were talking to young girls, and alongside our FGC work, we were really building our sexual and reproductive health work, like sort of just like a comprehensive program that we could have for the community. And at that time, the conversation, the youth were really saying, like, we just want to be here, but don't put like our name or a picture out in the spotlight. And so they wanted to support the work and really be there to push it forward, but from the background. And now I think most recently we had, a community gathering, and it was really a listening session where we were asking, these young women, what do you want? And they're like, we need to be talking about this. That's it. We're done with just, taking baby steps and sitting and, waiting for change to happen. And so our communities changed. And so now our approach is like, okay, how can we again speak to and really bring to fruition what you want, what you're asking for. And so they were ready to have like Subway ads and end FGMC like now. And we were like, okay, great, we'll do that. Whereas, a few years back, that really wasn't, that people were really much more timid in their approach. And so there's that constant learning that happens as you engage with community members from their end and from your end. And I think the big piece is to always maintain that credibility, that trust, as Teresa said, that connection with the community, like you're not just in and out, but that you're consistently there. You're doing what's called like enhanced outreach. So you show up at the food kitchen to just serve people for maybe a few months, and then you're finally able to just say like, listen, we'd also love to partner. We also love to support in other ways. And we, how can we sort of build a more lasting relationship and sort of take that to the next step. So it's, I think it's many of the I won't say common sense, but many of the approaches we already build on we already use to build those individual relationships, and taking that sort of the next step to say, how do we keep in mind our community needs and as we build those relationships in an intentional way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Roger, and thank you all three of you for answering those panelist questions. So I think in the interest of time, we probably only have time for one or two audience questions. If anyone wants to send any questions in the chat box for any of the panelists, please do so. But yeah, it'll probably only be one or two questions if anyone's interested.
It looks like Toby raised her hand.
Yes, I've unmuted, I think. I just want to thank each of the presenters, Nuzat and Maria, Teresa, and Hager. Each of you presented ideas that for which I'm very grateful. And the many projects that I've been in for so many years are now reflecting your wisdom. They have taken up a number of the points that you make. And because my field is comparative literature, I'm most attentive perhaps to the use of testimony and storytelling and this sort of thing. But I was really inspired by all of you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then we have one more question in the chat box, which is, would any of the panelists be willing to share one case study of how a community's older generations changed their attitudes toward FGM? So if any one of you have any experience with that, feel free to share.
I could share something, but oh, no, Hajar.
Yeah, no, I think I'll also probably be very brief. So Sotiatu does, since we really built out our FGC work in two fashions in a way, there's sort of the our department that works with women who've experienced any sort of violence, or now it's really open to the entire community, but women and girls who've experienced violence under a Violence Against Women and Girls program is really where we get our like sort of adult survivors who are coming in for additional for support. And there's I do know that it's wonderful to see as women who, even some who've been like mothers for such a long time, are the way that they process what has happened to them through like counseling and having an opportunity to speak to someone who is familiar with the practice, is familiar with their cultural background. And we're primarily working with the West African community here in New York City. They're a very sizable population in the Bronx. It's really nice to see how they're processing it for themselves, but they're mothers, right? And so in that, as their mothers, their aunts, their grandmothers, right? So they carry all of those roles with them. as they're processing for themselves. And they tend to also turn around and give back and advise others in their family, because they really are pillars in their community in that way. And so the conversation, what we've learned is the conversation that we have with each individual, particularly women, has the opportunity to really expand just past that and have influence on the family unit, influence on the larger community, because we also have, folks who've immigrated here, and then their aunts come, their uncles come. So they've gotten more extended relatives, and they're in close communication, interaction with them. And you can see how the conversations start to shift. So when they're, at a tea party or at, baby showers, and this conversation comes up, oh, did you hear so-and-so's daughter? Because it's spoken about in that way. Did you hear so-and-so's daughter? Oh, I heard, she was old enough to be cut. Or did you hear? And now you have someone who's in those spaces that can say, hey, why are we still doing this practice? Hey, don't you know this is what's actually hey, they're starting to counteract that, and they're growing in confidence in their ability to have those conversations. And I think a big piece of it too is finding the words that share exactly what they've experienced, but also how they can relay that back to the community. And they may not always be the same, I think, language that we use, but it is so beautiful to see how it clicks when they're in the right crowd. The way that they speak about it, it's like, oh, I wouldn't have explained it that way, but I'm so glad you did. And you can see instantly in the group how that resonates.
Thank you, Roger. So we do have one more question in the chat box that I think someone can very quickly, since we only have a few minutes left. But it says, would any of the panelists share the thoughts on medicalizations of FGMC, and what measures is your organization taking? So if someone wants to answer that in 2 minutes, and then we can start wrapping up.
That's a very big question, but I do think a medicalization, based on experiences within the United States, and just speaking with clients and survivors and everything, I do think medicalization is something that is growing in the US, and you hear more stories about that. But in terms of measures that are being taken, I think um, for us, at least, again, a lot of it is around it's very hidden, it's very secretive. So there isn't necessarily a lot you can do in the open about it, but it is more about having that dialogue, that discussion within the communities, and trying to reach individuals, and even implement or the idea that this is something that shouldn't be occurring. And you never know how that will reach somebody as well too. I do know that, so SEO works with the Bora community, for instance, and in the US, the first major case in the US happened to be in the Bora community, and it was a doctor that was involved. That got a lot of conversation going in the Bora community across the country, and not just here, but globally as well too. And I've heard conversations about that have happened where individuals have now talked in mosques about not having it done, but even in hush kind of conversations, because it was something that's still considered to be done, but because of this interaction, almost secretly being like, no, don't have it done. We're recognizing that there's harm, we're recognizing there's repercussions and that front as well too. So it's an interesting phenomenon that I've been learning about, and kind of hearing what's happening there. It is a much longer conversation, and I would love to chat with you longer if you would like to connect on it too. But I know we're running out of time, so I'll just stop there.
I'm going to share my own experience. It doesn't represent us together as opinion, just my personal opinion. Mm-hmm. I think that it only legitimizes FGMC, and world organizations are fighting against it. And bringing this to the doctor's office, it makes it legitimized rather than eradicated and eliminated. And it can also confuse families.
Thank you both so much. So if we could go back to the slides really quick. So again, we did share the link for the toolkit in the chat box earlier, and we can send it in the chat box again. And then we could just move on to the last slide. So this here has all of SEO's contact information with our email, our phone number, and our social media. And we'll also send out a follow-up email with the panelists and their organization's contact information as well. And then before everyone logs off, I will be launching like a quick little poll just to get your feedback on today's webinar. So if you could just take a few minutes to take that quick poll. But yeah, thank you all so much for attending. We hope you have really valuable insights from this webinar and are willing to use our toolkit in the work that you and your organization do. And we'll be staying on the call for a few more minutes if anyone has any other questions or comments or anything else you'd like to talk about. But yeah, thank you all so much. And thank you so much to the panelists, Maria, Teresa, and Hajar. And hope you all have an amazing day.